The apologetic and counter-apologetic world is often obsessed with questions about who wrote the Gospels, but rarely about the how of their composition or the subject of their publication and circulation. In fact, about those subjects, many myths persist, clouding our judgment and misleading us. New Testament scholar Nicholas Elder has written a book to deal with those myths, entitled Gospel Media, Reading, Writing, and Circulating Jesus Traditions. The volume covers issues surrounding ancient reading, writing, publication, and circulation practices, and the bearing they have on the canonical Gospels. Gospel media is divided into three major sections: reading, chapters 1 through 3, writing, chapters 4 through 6, and circulating, chapters 7 and 8. In the volume's introduction, Elder lays bare the main thesis of his work, about which each of these sections is designed to illuminate. The Gospels were not all read, written, or circulated the same way. They are characterized by media diversity. To drive this point home, each chapter begins first with a statement that is a media myth, followed by another that is a media reality. Such programmatic previews offer readers a chance to sit with the proposed thesis of each chapter at the outset, as well as guide them as the author organizes his writing around it. To open Part 1 on reading, Elder begins with a fact so obvious that it is easily overlooked. Reading is a social act. It isn't difficult to come up with scenarios in which this is self-evident. A weary parent reading "The Pigeon Has to Go to School" to their hopelessly energetic toddler before bedtime, a seasoned writer offering to a small crowd at a local bookstore a reading of selected portions of their recently published novel, a minister delivering from the pulpit a reading from the lectionary. But private readings, done alone, silently to oneself, are no less social in nature because, as Elder observes, the reader is engaging another person or person's thoughts. But is that which is true about the modern period also true of antiquity? In every way, Elder demonstrates in Chapter 1. While there is a commonplace in New Testament studies that reading was ordinarily, if not exclusively, done aloud, our author makes clear that this not only was not the case, but could not have been. In discussing the neuropsychology of reading, Elder notes that in order to read a text publicly, one must have already read the text privately, attributable to the eye-voice span. The idea is rather quite simple. When reading a text aloud, readers ordinarily preview the word or words ahead in preparation for vocal delivery. This silent reading, then, is a prerequisite to vocal reading. And given the many examples of vocal performances that can be mined from ancient literature, a subject covered at the end of the chapter, it can be said with confidence that such oral readings involved silent ones. Elder, in fact, provides example after example from the corpus of Greco-Roman writings that show persons reading silently. The practice, he writes, was well known. Chapter 2 covers a related topic: solitary and communal readings. Though scholars have often claimed communal reading was the norm, Elder dissents, writing that the textual evidence suggests otherwise. Our author surveys Greco-Roman texts, as well as Jewish and Christian ones, to show that solitary reading was no rarity. Additionally, material evidence points to texts created seemingly for the purpose of personal consumption. We have codices dated to the 3rd century CE that were quite small. Papyrus 78, for example, contains a portion of the Epistle of Jude, but measures only 5.3 by 2.9 centimeters. About this and other diminutive texts, the late Larry Hurtado wrote that their miniature size and unusual dimensions must indicate copies of texts for personal reading. Elder concurs. And as for communal reading, our author uncovers a wealth of data that shows communal reading did not take one particular form. It could be done in large groups, small groups, and in between groups. Whatever the case may have been, Elder opines, reading in private or public settings was a way to establish one's literary network and to promote oneself socially. Having dispelled myths surrounding the ways in which texts were engaged in antiquity, our author turns his attention in Chapter 3 to the canonical Gospels, contending that each Gospel is self-conscious about its textuality and its textual medium. He introduces readers to the idea of paratexts, features that accompany a text that we often take for granted. For example, a cover, a table of contents, etc. With regard to the Gospels, their paratexts are expressed either at the beginning or at the end of each narrative. Mark is a gospel, a medium that textualizes antecedent oral Jesus traditions. Matthew is a biblos, a book. Luke is an account, written initially for private readership. John, paratextually self-conscious at its end, is a biblion, a document. Paying attention to these self-designations attunes us to the development of early Christian reading culture, which consisted of different kinds of texts that made for different kinds of reading events. Following a brief preface offering an overview of Part 2 on writing, Chapter 4 looks at the nature of composition as it pertains to writing by hand. While it is no doubt true that letters could be dictated, there is ample evidence pointing to personal composition, whether they be letters from important persons in antiquity, letters recorded in ancient novels, or letters uncovered by researchers in treasure troves of papyri. Having presented and examined this data, Elder concludes the chapter by noting the premium placed on personally written letters, a symbol of sentimentality. But composing a work by hand was not only for letters, but included a variety of other media. Moreover, not every author valued writing by hand in the same way. Some preferred to employ it at the initial stages of writing, while others used it throughout the entire process. Chapter 5 considers writing by mouth, analyzing literary letters, papyri letters, and other literary compositions. At the outset, Elder makes it clear that not only did dictation affect the words written down, but dictation may not even be the appropriate term to refer to all writing by mouth in antiquity. For one thing, to write by mouth did not entail not writing by hand. Both modes of composition could be employed by any given author. For another, even when material was dictated, this in no way guaranteed that what was transcribed was the exact representation of the source's words. Writing by mouth introduces another person's thoughts, words, and style into a discourse. Detecting the mode of composition for any given text is no simple task, as authors, including those who stand behind the canonical Gospels, did not often indicate their process. Nevertheless, some compositional influences can be detected, Elder argues in Chapter 6. He spends considerable time in the Gospel of Mark, pointing readers to oral features that suggest it was a written text under the influence of orality. I consider two people to have been involved in the composition of the Gospel of Mark. One is speaker and one is writer, our author says. The signs are everywhere. The presence of idea units, the use of parataxis, various discourse markers, and the employment of the historical present. The other synoptics, however, are more textual in nature, and they often redact oral markers that their authors found in the Gospel of Mark. As for John, something else is going on, as, in Elder's view, it exhibits both literary and oral characteristics. Chapter 7, prefaced by a page giving a glimpse of the next section on publication and circulation of texts in antiquity, opens Part 3 of Gospel Media. Here, Elder begins with Raymond Starr's model of circulating texts, a series of concentric circles emanating from textualization all the way to the making of copies. As helpful as this model is, our author notes that it is too tidy, and in the subsequent pages offers a more complex take on publication and circulation of an author's work. He offers examples of accidental publication, revision, uncontrolled textualizations, and more. Once a discourse is textualized, Elder says, the possibility enters that the author might lose control of it. In the case of the Roman philosopher Galen, some of his notes, decidedly not intended for publication, ended up circulating and attributed to sources other than Galen. In Chapter 8, Elder looks at how the Gospels circulated, beginning with the Synoptics and especially the Gospel of Mark. Mark was composed as notes for limited circulation. Matthew and Luke wrote compositions for publication. Early church tradition has it that Mark was in some form or fashion rooted in an oral event, namely the teaching of Peter, and was intended not as something literary but as something approximating notes that would be shared with a select few. Corroborating this, Elder argues that Mark's style, lack of precision, abrupt ending, and more point to an unfinished text, one that was easily revised and reshaped by subsequent evangelists. This includes the author of the fourth Gospel, who, Elder contends, knew the Synoptic Gospels but chose to write his own distinctive take on the Gospel tradition. To conclude Gospel Media, our author spends 3 pages giving a succinct overview of the preceding 270 or so pages. Following this, there are a pair of appendices. The first covers papyri letters, complete with Greek text and English translation, that illuminate some of the points made in the volume's earlier chapters. The second is a companion to Chapter 6, and looks at conjunctions, parataxis, the use of the adverb euthus, and the historical present in the synoptics. Next is a glossary of terms, followed by a bibliography, arguably my favorite part of any volume, and indexes. Though Gospel Media managed to answer many questions I had about writing and publication in antiquity, it raised others. For example, if it is the case that the Gospel of Mark resembles notes written down from an oral event, does this mean that the evangelist did not write in the vein of ancient biography? Matthew Larson, a scholar to whom Elder looks to for support throughout the volume, contends that categorizing the Gospel of Mark as a bios flies in the face of the evidence. Observing that missing from Mark are things like Jesus' family lineage or stories about his birth and upbringing, he opines, thus, if Mark were a biography, it would lack many of the features characteristic of ancient biography. For his part, Elder does not seem to address directly the subject of the genre of Mark or of the other Gospels. His interest lies primarily in how these texts understand themselves in terms of their textuality. Nevertheless, it is hard to shake the idea that for Mark's Gospel to be notes, unrefined, incomplete, and non-literary, that this entails that it cannot be considered a member of the Bioi genre. Another related issue has to do with the literariness of the Markan narrative. Elder does a convincing job of showing that Mark's gospel originated in an oral event, and that it betrays its origins with a host of oral features. Our author affirms that Mark is a written text, and that it is influenced by the oral mode of communication. Yet, it is clear that the evangelist intended for his gospel to be read. As Jesus speaks of the desolating sacrilege in the Olivet Discourse, the evangelist interjects with the words, "Let the reader understand." This surprising stress on writtenness, as Helen Bond refers to it, shows up in other ways in the gospel. For example, in appeals to what was written, or Jesus' challenge of how his opponents read Holy Writ. Chris Keith, another scholar to whom Elder appeals, writes of Mark chapter 13, verse 14, that, with the authorial aside, Mark's gospel self-consciously reflects its cultural status as a material artifact, a book that requires a reader to vocalize its script. But if the Markan Gospel was intended primarily to be notes, and not a published literary document, this reference to the reader seems out of place. Elder, of course, anticipates this by noting that the textualization of Mark opens it to various types of reception, such that one way it was received was by the reader envisioned in Mark chapter 13, verse 14. He also points to ecclesiastical tradition, in which the Gospel of Mark was created so that the teachings of Peter, written down by Mark, could be reused in Christian gatherings. Additionally, there existed a tradition that claimed Mark subsequently traveled to Egypt and proclaimed the gospel there, which he had written, and first established the churches at the city of Alexandria. But again, for the evangelist to have considered a reader at all suggests that his work must have had some measure of literary quality. Indeed, many commentators find narrative artistry in the pages of the Markan Gospel, as evidenced by the presence of intercalation, recurring themes, the use of foreshadowing, and more. It would appear that Mark intended for his Gospel to be read by someone. Astute consumers of this review have perhaps themselves noted that this poses no problem for Elder's thesis. As noted earlier, it seems that early tradition envisioned the gospel as fit for a limited audience. That is, it seems the Gospel of Mark was originally intended for the use of a few. But, as Elder notes in chapter 7, publication was not always a clean business. Many texts that had been intended for a few could end up in the hands of many. Such accidental publication perhaps explains how subsequent authors, for example Matthew and Luke, were able to get their hands on a copy of Mark with which they produced their own accounts of Jesus' life. But what about the genre of Mark? If it is not itself an example of biography, it could nevertheless be notes anticipating one. The historian Plutarch, in all likelihood, used notes when preparing to write his lives. And Josephus, too, seems to have written what amounts to be hypnomnemata for his Jewish war while a captive of Rome. Thus, the Gospel of Mark could have been the pre-literary stage of what was supposed to become a more polished literary document, but never would be. At least not until the Matthean and Lucan evangelists arrived on the scene. We have come full circle. My hope for this review is that it shows just how much there is to chew on in gospel media. Elder is neither the first word nor the last on the subject, but in this moment he is perhaps the best. While I have highlighted so little of what makes this volume remarkable, my aim was to whet your appetite. Buy the book, consume it, wrestle with it, contemplate it. My more skeptical audience would benefit from having a more robust understanding of how ancient texts were written, published, and circulated. There are many persistent myths about the Gospels, and Elders, Gospel Media, reading, writing, and circulating Jesus Traditions manages to deal with them in a concise and readable manner.